Welcome everyone to this final wrap-up discussion of the Mott Climate Collective. We've had a year of programming activities, covered a lot of ground, and we thought it would be good to start with just remembering our original mission statement, and then have an informal discussion about what the key takeaways and lessons have been. What are people's experiences and observations about the last year of programming activity through this project called From Climate Emergency to Emergence. So we began with this statement, and I'm joined by Malema Moiloa in South Africa, Susan Shipley in London, and Paulo in Brazil, and I'm T.J. Demos in California. So it's been wonderful to work with everyone, and we've had some amazing guests. So this is the statement that we began with at the beginning of the last year. So bringing urgent focus to climate emergency, Mott Climate Collective energizes critical analyses and creative proposals in moving beyond catastrophism and toward the emergence of environmentally sustainable and socially just futures. Interdisciplinary in breadth and international in scope, our program assembles diverse cultural practitioners working at the intersection of experimental arts and political ecology in a year-long project of collective deliberation. The goal to unveil horizons of thought and action, vital for a livable future, dedicated to unpacking the complexities, socioeconomic, juridical, political, techno-environmental, and cultural of climate transformation. Rather than viewing climate emergency as uniquely situated in the not yet, we insist on connecting present anxieties over climate breakdown to long histories of socio-environmental violence, preparing the ground of near future collapse, past formations of colonial extractivism and racial capitalism have already multiplied emergencies and continue to do so in our present. They also widen the scope of emergency beyond the narrow focus on atmospheric carbon, expanding it to complex entanglements of socio-political and techno-economic climates within and beyond the human. So with that, we had several questions that we asked over the last year, including what reparatory climate features are necessary once we adopt greater historical sensitivity to socio-environmental emergencies, and how might these manifest through new frameworks of ecologies of care and mutual aid, framed as solidarity, not charity, and in what ways do technologies of sensing not only observe climate transformation, but construct objects of knowledge, science, and politics in different ways, and reimagine relationships with the more than human realm. Okay, so with that, why don't we open it up? And just wondering initially if anyone has anything that they'd like to begin with and as a response.
Maybe
yeah, Paulo.
I just want to, actually, it's not a response. It's just for us to reflect. We have been together during 2021 as the Climate Collective, and as TJ just mentioned, we had great discussions among ourselves internally, and also a great lineup of speakers and practitioners and activists and artists. And maybe we should just think about a reflection of, what was this year, 2021, which for me was the year that somehow marked a kind of beginning, sorry for the noise on the streets, but a kind of, I wouldn't say a beginning, but the kind of realization that we are in effect in climate change, right? That climate change as the frame of this collective and the framing of the conversations that we had is not something it's in the future, right? But it's something that's kind of happening now, and we would need a checklist to write the sort of extreme climate events that the world has experienced during last year, and I'm sure that each one of us would come up with a different list from the place that we live and that we have been, and of course that our guests as well and our public as well. So it's kind of remarkable that, you know, the year that we have been addressing the question of climate emergency and what can emerge from this was in a way a year sort of devastated by different sort of climate catastrophes. And I'm saying this because, you know, in the moment that we are now in Brazil, and speaking from Brazil, we are seeing torrential rains, you know, really storms devastating entire cities. It's kind of impressive. Of course, we always have, you know, this type of heavy rain during the summer, but this year has been particularly strong, and, you know, and thousands of families losing everything that they had. Of course, those are the most vulnerable that are affected. And at the same time, we are seeing one of the worst droughts in the southern of Brazil, including also the southern of South America, Argentina. Buenos Aires just experiencing its highest temperature from, you know, from the late 1900s, from the late 1800s. So yeah, maybe I think it was somehow a year where, you know, all theoretical discussions on climate emergence and climate change, somehow they became real effects. Not that they were not before, but it seems to me that this year, and maybe that's something I want to throw on the table, that this year was particularly remarkable in the way that we saw the sort of effects of climate change beginning to unfold. And of course, we need to remember that we had the prospect of ending one of the worst pandemics in the history of human life. And in fact, it's a pandemic that still is going on because of several mutations of the virus. And we are still not sure if it's going to end, when it's going to end, and if it's going to end. So somehow it seems to me that we are seeing the wings of climate change unfolding, as one activist puts on the ground. I just want to sort of maybe beginning with this reflection, since we are speaking kind of retrospectively about this year that has passed.
That's that's important to raise, Paulo. Thank you for that. I'm wondering, maybe it would be useful to just go around and to think about how we've each experienced this in the last year, in terms of just the presence of climate breakdown. Anyone want to pick up where Paulo left off from their own, you know, specific location?
I mean, excuse me. For me, one of the most, I think, powerful experiences I suppose I had in 2021 was actually not when I was in the UK, but rather when I was in the Himalayas, and this real sense of like this kind of radical impossibility of connecting the dots to kind of very extremely localized situations of water scarcity and drought that very impoverished mountain communities were experiencing, and somehow situating that within a context where the cause of their experience is to be found sort of elsewhere. And for me, it was just, I'm stating the obvious, but it was just somehow, it seemed almost insurmountable, to be perfectly honest, as a challenge in terms of bringing the sort of world in which I live, that is extremely reliant on a whole set of extractivist practices that have been, you know, the direct contributors to our current condition, and histories of obviously of also living in a settler colonial context for much of my life. So all of those histories that have been fundamental to the experience of precarious and affected communities. And when you're in working in those contexts and spending time, and albeit very little in terms of, I was there very, very kind of briefly, nonetheless, it was really hard to sort of imagine a way out of that sort of impasse, a way out of that, like how do those radically incommensurate worlds in which we move somehow connect in a meaningful way. I found that really incredibly difficult to even conceptualize what that might be and what that would require. At the same time, there was no sort of luxury on the part of the people who were having to find sources of water. It means enforced migration, basically, to other communities. There wasn't, I said luxury, there's no time, let alone context for having a kind of a theoretical discussion or even thinking about the role of art or anything like that in those kind of like situations, in as much as we wanted to avoid thinking about or not to sort of privilege the paradigm of emergency and crisis to expand the temporal kind of frame. Nonetheless, under those kind of extreme conditions and the kinds of conditions that Paolo was also talking about, really resilience at best, adaptability, somehow learning to survive is obviously what's at stake. And it strikes me that the sort of, like cultural practices seem very, in some way, secondary to what could possibly kind of intervene. So that was sort of my probably most kind of like sort of focused or sort of most kind of compelling or provocative experience of the past year, I guess. And then I returned to my sort of life here, where one has the more meta-reflective space, right? So maybe leave it there for the moment.
I think I in some ways a slightly similar connection to Susan of kind of being present in a part of the country that has, well, in South Africa at the end of last year, the year kind of culminated with this massive battle against Shell, against kind of shale project just off the coast of a part of the country that is a really complex and difficult part of the country. And that battle was won, and that battle was won in quite an interesting, probably like the most visible battle of its type in South Africa for a long time, but also won across kind of long-term environmental activists, the kind of white middle class concerned citizens who kind of are worried about the whales, who have been the kind of mainstay of environmental politics, but also very closely interlinked with local peoples of that region who've been undertaking major battles against various mining agencies in the area for many years, in ways that have become incredibly violent and really dangerous. So it's kind of one of the first really sort of major intersections of these different spaces in an interesting way in South Africa. But similarly to Susan, I spent my last days of the year in that region, and also quite struck by the nature of that area being subject to many decades of abandonment, in a sense, and like recognizing the complexities of what it means to stop things that can often be seen as development in contexts where people are really desperate, and where migrant labor is the only other option, and that these become the kinds of results of systematic disinvestment in peoples, particularly really poor peoples in a particular region. And I think really exciting to see the shifts that are happening in my own context, in starting to really recognize those intersections. And I feel like, Paolo, your statement around sort of think people starting to see in 2021, I think is something I've certainly felt as well. Very much at the beginnings, but I think more and more people are starting to recognize these interconnections, which is, I think, very much what we as a group, we're trying to unpack and also provide a lot more space to be conversant around. I think one of the key things that I really learned so much last year, having sort of come to this subject relatively green, and one of the things that has certainly been huge for me, which I think is very much the next sort of step, is in terms of those new alternatives and those new strategies of being that so many, particularly artists, are kind of experimenting with and trying to reimagine. And I think that's the space for me that doesn't feel like we've really shifted into yet, but is perhaps coming.
Yeah, thank you. For me, based in California, in Santa Cruz, there's lots of stuff that's like a kind of ongoing present emergency, but maybe the most dramatic is wildfires. And the fact that we're in this regular annual season of what we're calling fire season. And it's getting earlier and it's getting longer every year, particularly in the last decade. And these wildfires, because this has happened for several years, there's a number of us here who are really keen to study it and to think about how this connects to more structural issues. So I totally agree with what Susan said in terms of, at times when emergency strikes, when climate catastrophe strikes, there's not really time to reflect or to analyze because you don't have that critical distance. But we've been developing it over the years, and it's really telling, I think. First of all, many of these wildfires in our area are caused by a power company called PG&E, Pacific Gas and Electric, which is a big private utilities company. And that's key that they're private. It's shareholder owned. So this is basically a company that, instead of putting money into maintaining their lines for safety, are lining the pockets of shareholders who are invested in the company. And it's basically putting profits over people. So it's an example of just neoliberal privatization. And then when fires break out, they often are most threatening to private property. Private property, of course, that's built on stolen land within a colonial frontier zone, where people, in many cases, have moved into forested, redwood forested areas that aren't really sustainable for private domestic dwelling. So that itself is an encroachment of private property on the natural world. And then when these fires break out, as they have in the last summer, there's a deficit of labor in terms of firefighters because of the pandemic situation. And so, because in the States, there's a tendency to put profits over welfare of people, there's an insistence that people just, continue to work and go to work, even if the epidemic is threatening their lives. And so we've seen that. As a result, the state has been turning to prison labor to fight fires. So this taps into the continuing emergency of racialized mass incarceration in the States, which is an enormous and also partly privatized industry. And that's been problematic as well, not simply because of those reasons already stated, but because the pandemic has been especially bad within prison conditions, where there's a lack of healthcare, lack of social distancing. And we've just had this spread. So in other words, the wildfires in California are just like symptomatic of the ongoing crisis, I think, of racial and colonial capitalism in the way that really affects us in a deeply threatening and personal way. Like a couple of years ago during the CZU fire, which was one of the biggest in the state's history, Santa Cruz itself, which is a small but urban center, was itself threatened by wildfire. We were like a moment's notice away from an evacuation order. And of course, during these wildfires, the toxicity in the air quality is really worsened with all this particulate matter, all the stuff that burns, including plastics and heavy metals and infrastructure, causing this toxic miasma in the atmosphere. So it's just, when we talk about climate emergency, this is very much present, visceral. It's an embodied experience. It's threatening right now. It's situated within conditions of deep economic inequality that also gets racialized. It's connected to the history of colonization. So in other words, many of the stuff that some of our speakers, from Wretched of the Earth to Olufemi Taiwo, to the Racial Justice Network, to Imani Jacqueline Brown, Carolyn Caicedo, to the artists Ama Josephine Budge and Tabitha Rezer, Jonas Stahl and Rada D'Souza. Everyone has, repeatedly emphasized these conditions. So I think it's been really striking to be living through these conditions and also trying to bring it into an intellectual discussion, which sometimes can be quite challenging and difficult.
Yeah, maybe on that note, if I may, it's interesting what Susan said, and I guess DJ also elaborate on that cultural practice or artistic practice becomes secondary, right? In the confronting the urgency, one does not find time when you are sort of, in the front lines of climate change to the kind of meta reflection or conceptual reflection. And I think Mulemo also touched on the kind of shifts that might be allowed by artistic practice, but maybe they are not yet there. And I guess one of the premises of our project or our own practice is, of course, that we share the belief that cultural practices and artistic practice are sort of relevant to make things visible, to make things sensible, to bring public awareness, to create different narratives, to show, as TJ was just mentioning, that climate change is structurally bounded with the legacies or the continuity of colonial capitalism and the way that it plays on racialized structures to extract surplus. So just to throw this on the table again, maybe. And to reflect on our own practice as organizing this series. Is it a dead end to cultural practice or artistic practice? Do you have the time to do cultural work? To reflect on climate change? Do you still believe that it's something crucial? And it's interesting that Susan, you particularly your own practice and the example that you addressed, and also the roundtable that was very much informed by your practice and your work, is very much aligned with sort of a kind of politics of culture, politics of art, as it intersects with climate change and the possibilities that art and culture open for that. So I found it interesting that you, as a kind of yourself experiencing this during a project, somehow had second thoughts on the potential of it.
No, I mean you're absolutely right. I mean, of course, I've spent the better part of my life deeply committed to the possibility of a certain kind of aesthetic political kind of practice and the necessity. Or for to really I would say I definitely maybe contrary to the ways in which say Jonas Stahl might think about art, and this is to bring in one of the guests, and he's often sort of utilized strategies and the instruments of the art world for another kind of means, right? So the kind of institutional structures allow him to make certain strategic kind of moves. So to invite somebody under the auspices of being an artist because they're actually maybe part of like they might be on an anti-terror list or something like that, and so has really used mechanisms of art to produce these kind of para-political or para-legal kinds of structures and kind of mechanisms. And to me, that always struck me perhaps as somewhat cynical in terms of what that the artist needed to establish a situation kind of like outside or exterior to the context in which key decisions were being made, etc. So I would say like the work that we've done in the center and the work that we've done in the Forensic Architecture Agency has been to develop relationships of what we sort of would call critical proximity, but and to be deeply kind of like in some way oftentimes entrenched in the very problem and context and institutions that we're seeking at the same time to kind of like push at the limits of or to radicalize in some way. That being said, I guess one of the things that I've found consistently is the more that I collaborate, all of my collaborators, whether they're lawyers or scientists, they completely understand the need for that they need to constitute their own relevance to society at large, and that the research is only in some way meaningful if it actually can do that. But I still find myself, despite sort of my experiences and practice, still occupying largely a kind of space of public advocacy and narration in really, like the kind of public kind of narrator. So maybe, yeah, the artist is often, in my experience, is sometimes the interlocutor that can bring different kinds of stakeholders together or somehow, bring different communities of interest together, like through a set of shared questions, and try and somehow find those kinds of points of connectivity. But I still often find myself in some way, ultimately, the role that I'm sort of asked to play, I would say, is the role of sort of narrator, of documenting, of communicating. That's kind of what's being asked of me. So maybe it's more about like how will I respond to this sort of external demands that understands the necessity with engaging with like the social from the say context of the scientist, but how is it that I could contribute meaningfully beyond being a kind of conduit for sort of public kind of like information? That's still, I think, has been such a kind of significant sort of like not obstacle, but a challenge. So on the one hand, yes, I completely agree. That's like that. I'm fully committed to the productive capacity of an aesthetic imagination and its kind of political kind of dimensions. At the same time, like the practical, concrete ways in which that sometimes works its way out is perhaps sometimes much more conventional, I would say, despite this sort of the desire for the desire that I might bring in terms of how like the point of view of an artist in a difference opens up different entry points into a situation, and opens different registers, different sense, perhaps different modes of sensing, etc., different sensibilities, subjectivities, etc., etc. I don't know if that really makes much sense, but somehow this kind of friction, I guess, between the claims that one might make on behalf of one's practice or set of practices, and the concrete ways in which some of that gets worked out on the ground. There's friction for sure.
I mean, Susan, I find that friction really kind of inspiring and exciting, because I mean, I think that in some senses we're still very much at the beginning of trying to work out how to bring these things together, and how to find value across these two spaces. And I think that the commitment to friction is probably like really the first step. And I think it's interesting, sort of as you mentioned, Susan, Jonas Stahl having quite a different sort of approach to try to work through that friction, or someone like Tabitha Rezer, who's starting her own space and learning to farm. You know, that artists are having to test out multiple strategies for what it means to try and bring art into sort of out of a kind of modernist distancing and distant observation into relation with the kind of current urgencies, and to try and work out what we offer, I suppose. And I think that's, yeah, we could probably be a bit more generous with ourselves that we're kind of still working that out, because it is, I think, relatively new space that artists are venturing into. And I mean, across the different projects that we looked at over the year, I think there's some really exciting potentials for trying to sort of imagine anew and create new futures. That does seem to be the kind of sticking point in terms of where a global conversation around dealing with the current crisis needs to move to, right? That like getting stuck in crisis mode doesn't move us anywhere, and we need as many sort of hands in the battle of thinking about where we go next as possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in particular, we had a recent, we did, this is just to respond briefly, we did a walk with the London Mining Network, which is an activist network that really tries to pressure like shareholders of major mining consortiums, et cetera. It was really illuminating on multiple kind of levels, but also the degree to which just the degree to which, say, something like the MOD, the Ministry of Defense, has embraced a green agenda as part of their day-to-day operating, both at the level of having, if you can, developing, and they've already done this in Britain, like bullets that don't contain lead because of the problem of lead poisoning in environments. Now, bullets that, of course, are still designed to like inflict harm and kill, but nonetheless, they don't have the same sort of environmental impact. And they were telling me, they were telling us rather, about the ways in which the Ministry of Defense really understands that the environment matters to young people, and if we're going to have a future, if they're going to recruit, they need to get on board with a green agenda, because they're completely reliant on the people who are like 12 and 15 years old today to be the sort of whatever, the employees of the future. So I think there's this kind of it seems to me like there's incredibly, if very next to no sort of space to somehow to do the work that's required before like climate change becomes completely instrumentalized for all, it already has been, of course, for all kinds of like like corporate kind of initiatives, like deep sea mining is another case in point. If we're going to transition to the renewable energy economy, then where are we going to find alternate sort of energy sources? Well, we're going to like look at open up these other kind of extractivist kinds of streams. So yeah, the degree to which I think the space to work strategically seems like the that window seems incredibly kind of small, from sort of like my vantage point, I suppose. So I worry about the way, I worry about the space of art and alternate sort of modes of organization when confronting this kind of relentless and sort of the omnipotence of these other kind of actors. But anyway, I've said enough, and I don't want to like cast everything with this kind of like sense of despair, but it's been an incredibly illuminating sort of year to think back on. And that also, of course, like I was talking to Adrian LaHood, who was at COP26, and he said it was really in some way shocking the degree to which the fossil fuel lobby had completely hijacked COP. And so, yeah, like what is it? What can be done is is a really hard question.
And that's been one that we've been trying to address for the last year. And I think when we think about green military neoliberalism, it's indeed despairing, and certainly that's happening globally. It's been going on within the U.S. military, the greening of the military in the most cynical ways, sometimes for strategic reasons. When the Navy becomes concerned that many of its bases are threatened with rising seas, for instance. But they're very aware of it and are making amends and even trying to sell their activities in some ways through an environmentalist imagination. But I think I wanted to come back to this issue of how do we move to from like an understanding of art is largely about an aesthetics of political imagination. And in some ways we began with that, with Thurza Jean Cuthand's video reclamation of an indigenous futurism. Like, how can we imagine a future beyond the colonial present of the destructive emergency of climate breakdown, even while we locate that emergency in 500 years of colonial history? But there's still the question, like, what can art do? It can do that, but that's in some ways a very modest contribution, as essential as it is. But what more can art do? And here I think I would, I'm thinking of against Jonas Stahl and Rada de Souza's court as a kind of prefigurative juridico-political institution building practice that, for me, I think that's really interesting and is an area where there's an attempt to push art as a platform that can be a collaborative space also with social movements, environmental justice and climate justice organizations, collectively developing a process, even though it doesn't have a present legal legitimacy or enforceability, but it's a prefigurative attempt to build exactly that kind of potential for the future, which is certainly a way forward. That's a kind of, that situates the artist as an agent of emergence. For me, I think Imani is also doing this in terms of the forensic model that she's working with, in terms of Louisiana and Death Alley, and this condition of petrochemical toxicity as it is affecting African-American frontline communities. Like, how can forensic technologies of sensing locate the cemeteries of historically enslaved people and thereby protect them as a matter of African-American heritage that's also simultaneously a climate justice politics against the expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure? I think there too, there's a building of institutional power against fossil fuel industries that are otherwise monopolizing climate governance, like at COP26. And she also is importantly working in relationship to this methodology of ground truthing, with local frontline communities. I think there's something really important, in other words, in terms of what, again, Olufemi Taiwo emphasized, which is this constructive view of building a future together, that artists are turning to collectivization and collaboration with social movements. I think that's something that I've picked up on and is a takeaway with me. So the question, what I'm playing with here is how to connect the aesthetics of political imagination to the aesthetics of emergence as a form of building social power and the institutions of that will allow us to survive. So how can we move from the apocalypse reading room of Amma Josephine Budge, for instance, where she's inviting people to come and gather and read about what's most important, what are the resources that we need to survive, toward what Tabita Rezer is doing in Amazonia in terms of actually creating new inhabitations for an expanded humanization within the more than human realm. But so, how can we move again from emergency to emergence? Clearly, there's been some narratives within our programming that have really, I think, struck a chord in doing that.
I think another chord that really emerges for me, which is also, I think, something that I hold on to very tightly, is a kind of aesthetic and intellectual practice that takes very seriously the histories we've come from. And so the Apocalypse Reading Room kind of really grounding us in sort of radical histories of resistance. Olufemi Taiwo also sort of reminding us of a similar thing. And I think Thursday Katan's film did this really, really well of kind of recognizing a humility in the fact that many have come before us and kind of faced insurmountables many times before, no? And the degrees to which really placing our practice in that longue durée can sort of give us not only hope, for lack of a better word, but also strategy, I think. And a number of these artists, Imani doing something similar, working from a historical background in order to inform strategies in order not to be reinventing the wheel. And I think sort of Olufemi's call to quite strategically utilize these kinds of histories, but also to then into the present and into the future kind of continue these intersectional solidarities and kind of cross-cutting approaches is something that I think I hold on to very tightly from last year as something that is a kind of quick fix for me to step out of the place of tragedy and disaster into action, I think.
So what kind of work needs to be done, do you all think? Like, what are you coming away with in terms of new priorities, or reanimated priorities that have benefited from the last year of discussion? I mean, certainly we just mentioned the need to create more spaces of living in a way that are sustainable, like creating new kinds of ways of living with the more than human world, whether it's through new kinds of farming practices, agroecology, building worlds also in legal and political ways, thinking about new forms of sensing and technologies of observation, like listening to ice with Susan's project has been really crucial, and also how it's connected to local knowledges. And I think that a term that Susan used in that conversation that I really liked is rethinking science as hospitality. Right? There's enormous divergence between cultural practices and science in many parts of the world. And so I think that the Listening to Ice project is really exemplary in terms of trying to situate scientific procedures of listening to glaciers, listening to ice, within largely female-based local communities. Bring people who are living in the area of the Himalayas to the glacier, places where they've never been before, and inviting a kind of listening practice where science becomes a form of hospitality. But the broader question is, what other takeaways, what other future work do you all see, or what are you thinking about?
Maybe just, I mean, I don't know. It's a big question, I think, what should be done? Of course, maybe nobody has an answer, and the very fact of trying to find one is what we need to keep doing, because there's going to be none, right? But maybe something that was important for me in I don't know if I can talk with a lot of property about that, but this idea how care, how politics of care, how an ecology of care became something central, both it was already central, so to speak, in everyday lives, right? And if I'm not mistaken, there is this text by Dave Graeber when he mentions how workers, laborers, in fact, what they provide most of the time, not, as classical political economy theory would have, which is labor, but is in fact the labor of care, right? And of course, with the pandemic, we sort of realized what is a politics of care, and how it is in many different ways what keeps society together in different ways, in communities and societies. And this also implies a discussion what resources are, right? What resources can we share? What constitute a resource, right? And it's kind of interesting. And this, I don't know if this is going to make sense, but I want to throw this, TJ mentioned in the beginning, the idea of an ecology of care. I'm mentioning Graeber. I don't know if I am mentioning him wrong, because I'm just sort of reading The Dawn of Humanity. I don't know if you saw this sort of massive volume, and it's a book that came out after his passing, and there is a chapter which for me is kind of remarkable, maybe because I'm too involved in that, when he's going to try to show how the whole theory, or entire values of enlightenment that that Europe sort of or even we can say white Europe claims it belongs for itself. It's in fact has came from indigenous scholars, intellectuals, politicians, that all those guys, all those philosophers in Europe were somehow in contact with. But of course, we knew a little bit about that, but the book sort of makes a much bolder claim, on trying to show how a different way of thinking, or a different way of knowledge, which is very much grounded on care, sort of shaped ideas as freedom, as liberty, that were somehow hijacked and transformed in a system of power and oppression. In connecting to this idea of the hospitality that TJ just mentioned in the work of Susan, I think we discussed this a lot, right? How there are certain types of knowledge that are ancestral knowledge, from many hundreds and hundreds of years of people living those areas and knowing those areas, and how this has become super important. And I think science is realizing that, because science is somehow refractory to that, it kind of relies very much on a kind of Western rational episteme. So one way in which I think artists and art in the cultural field is really sort of pushing forward a different type, and even intellectuals in academy, a different type of agenda and a different type of opening, a sort of space of political imagination, a kind of different political aesthetics, also conceptual aesthetics, in trying to think climate change. It's really try to bring those types of knowledge into the table, and those types of practice into the table in a kind of very meaningful and serious way. And in my view, I think, this is something that I think to respond to your question, that what needs to be done. I think this is for me, one of the most sort of important sort of tasks for us to act, maybe, as Susan would say, as translators or narrators, or, documenting things, or bring those things to, to play the important role that they have, and not be, concealed or just left as a kind of side footnote in the history of humanity. And I think somehow, ideas of, conceiving how, a political juridical ground, as in the work that we saw with Susan de Souza and sorry, I forgot the name. Just
Stahl.
Yeah, Jonas Stahl. Very much coming from a kind of way of seeing the world that everyone is a subject, or, it's a kind of shared sort of political ground. So, I think, the way in which we now realize that forests are thinking beings, or they relate to each other, or, there is something more that is going on there. And this recognition also, the work, just to mention the word friction again, of Anat Singh, right? When, the Feral Atlas and the kind of art / conceptual work that she's doing. And of course, very much based on her incredible experience and also her incredible capacity of transforming things that she sees on the ground in aesthetic concepts. So in my way, in my view, I think that's one of the most important sort of, or at least that's a space that, arts and thinkers and activists are really opening up, and allowing us to create an imagination of, what this world could be. In this world, what's remarkable, it already exists, right? It's already somehow, immanent, or, in places. And it's just a way of looking at things in a different lens, with a different lens, a decolonial lens in a certain way.
Maybe sort of expanding on what Paulo was saying, I think that one of the ways that we see these kind of various knowledges emerging is in learning from other places. And while, I think I knew, and I started working with Paulo on the basis of a kind of need within our own context to connect to these very specified histories in other places that connect to our own. I think that was something that came forward for me in a number of the talks of kind of what needs to be done next, where to go further. I think it came through quite strongly with Margarita Mendes right in the beginning, around kind of these localized, interconnected histories. Philippa Cesar's film as well. But then very particularly with the session by Wretched of the Earth and the Racial Justice Network, who I think really pushed forward the capacity for these kind of very localized, and I suppose Olufemi Taiwo also spoke to this, very localized but interconnected movements, right? And how to work in deep and local ways against a global problem and a global issue. I think that became a kind of vital learning from so many different corners of the world over the past year, and collaborations across very sort of distant contexts, such as in Susan's project. But being able to connect these very sort of specific local issues to broader global ones that also make sense in the local context to people kind of facing their immediate issues, and then networked into bigger policy or sort of science kinds of concerns. So that's definitely, I think, a major way forward in terms also of strategies of not necessarily having to chart across the globe or to meet in mass conferences like COP17, though I suppose there will always be some space for that. But in these other ways that we're able to link together and find solidarities and really kind of connect to each other's struggles quite strongly.
Something maybe that I could offer in relationship to this sort of reflective session, and it goes back to what we were saying at the very beginning, and everyone amongst the four of us talking about these kind of like extreme environmental events of the past sort of year. And I think one of the things that I think is really quite extraordinary, and I also would, to me the pandemic is also in some way paradigmatic of that, the degree to which people have in some way self-educated themselves in relationship to the field of epidemiology. Now, with varying degrees of nonetheless, I'm sure the internet is the major source, and people have gone down various sort of like into various kind of portholes where perhaps where certain kinds of like myths and conspiracies might emerge. But nonetheless, I mean, I'm really struck by the degree to which any person that I meet has knowledge about a virus and and oftentimes quite comprehensive, seemingly comprehensive, and that's sort of like this Uli. Sorry, my dog Uli has to have a final bark in this final session. But where knowledge resides, and I really think that this, and like Faiza was talking about that too, I feel that that's so. Where for the lawyer, for the scientist, these kind of professional disciplines, like climate change in some way occupies a very specific category and consequently certain, or for a kind of someone who's drafting legislation or a kind of convention or something like that. There's a very, like, where knowledge about climate change resides sometimes seems quite constrained. And I think a lot of the conversations we've had, personal experiences, but I think this is really where culture plays a huge role, is being attentive to the fact that this sort of like evidence for climate change and environmental transformations is encoded in everyday experience, in cultural practices, in observation. And somehow to me that's been incredibly kind of productive, is to like expand our collective understandings to say that knowledge about environmental transformation is held in all of these ways that we wouldn't necessarily, depending on the kind of professional discipline that sets up a certain kind of paradigm of analysis, doesn't actually take into account. And that I think has been really kind of crucial, at least is very kind of crucial for me. And but also I think we can really look at something like this sort of like the self-education that was part of the kind of learning about the kind of pandemic. In some way that actually gives me a lot of hope that there's a kind of collective will to find out about something, be informed, take on complicated technical kind of like understandings of phenomena, so that there is that possibility and a kind of like collective awareness and building of knowledge around a subject that wasn't there 2-3 years ago. So I think that's sort of like the kind of the politics are now around the production of knowledge and being attentive to the multiple, being attentive to the understanding where knowledge about climate change resides, and how do we actually translate a kind of like a local event and actually understand it to be like that is in fact climate change, that we're actually, that's actually what's at stake, is climate change in a myriad of like kind of daily events, occurrences, etc. And to really like start to name that in some way as climate change or as environmental knowledge, where perhaps it was just sort of inexperience or a passing comment. And yeah. TJ, did you want to respond to anything? These moments of reflection, they're so important, but it's also I wish in some way there had been an occasion where we were all together spending time.
Yeah, definitely. And that was our plan, but the pandemic, Omicron, got in the way, and it's been just impossible. Like from the very beginning, we were hoping that we would have in-person sessions as well as Zoom sessions, and that's really just unfortunate. But we were able to do a lot online, and that's been really fantastic. Being able to get the artists and practitioners that we've invited in has been, I think, really extraordinary. So I've really enjoyed these conversations. I still have lots to think about. Paulo raised the book Dawn of Everything, and that early interaction between indigenous people and Enlightenment European colonizers, and how there's this argument that's the spark of all the Enlightenment ideas around freedom, like what freedom really means. Freedom is and justice, not freedom as it became a project of capitalist property relations, but freedom is something that was about emancipation and universal liberation. So in the back of my head, I'm thinking of Ariela Azule's proposal that modernity is an imperial crime, and the possible condemnation of modernity in totality, I think, is something that maybe the Dawn of Everything also raises in a certain way and invites us to think about more. Clearly, we're not going to answer this now, but how do we figure out ways of negotiating and enlivening the emancipatory potentials that exist within modernity, even if it is an indigenous inheritance, against the potentially devastating conclusion that modernity itself and all the dominant systems that we're living with today, in terms of including militarism, science in its hegemonic state, the capitalist economy, and all the intersecting areas and institutions and disciplines. Like, how do we create spaces of livability within those situations, and somehow recruit the emancipatory potential of modernity, so that we're not considering any nostalgic urge to go back to a pre-colonial past? Those are some of the big questions that I'm thinking about right now. I don't know, any last thoughts of where this should leave us? I think the work is definitely cut out for us, in terms of if we urgently need to recreate conditions of relationality on the most fundamental level, in terms of caring for the world that we live in. How do we do that within the conditions of ongoing oppression of these dominant hegemonic systems? And thinking about art as this incredibly small, modest form of practice, but a place where I think many of us are able to live, and find refuge from these larger conditions of just intersecting oppression. But yeah, other ideas, any other thoughts, last minute thoughts?
Maybe just one thought. Actually, there is a thought in a question for you, but maybe this doesn't need to be in the final video. So just say, as a thought, I think arts, STJ, to respond to your question, it is indeed that space where we could find refuge, or we could build other forms of relationality. I'm thinking about, the sensibility of artists in art networks to, the upheavals that have happened also in the past 2 years, right? So we see how, activists are, in fact, we see how culture and cultural institutions have become a kind of, front line, a battleground for social justice, for reparations, for, dismantling racial capitalism. We can feel it that, cultural institutions are on the spot. They became a site of struggle. And as imperfect as they are, and as complicit as they have been with imperial modes of knowledge and power and things like that, and art also finds a way of challenging this, and we see that there is at least an attempt towards a certain type of a shift or change, right? Or at least the conversations that these generate can bring some hope. I don't know if hope is the right word, but can create this space for a new type of relationality between humans, and of course between something more than human or non-human. And I guess something that I noticed in the last year, I don't know if I noticed this correctly, but art institutions have been much more, specifically in Europe and I think in the US, much more concerned with questions of climate and ecology. Somehow, I think the work that many of us have been doing, somehow, it kind of got to a point when, questions of non-human rights or rights of nature or, ecology of care or agroecology or, different types of relationship, what is resources, what constitutes a resource and things like that are somehow being incorporated by institutions, or, we are finding spaces in art institutions to discuss agendas like that, because of course they became urgent. The thing is, as if structurally there's going to be a meaningful change, and what does this structural change means besides just sort of serving the more content driven sort of aspects of showing narratives and visualities and things like that. And somehow the art world, the way it was after during globalization, it was something very harmful for the environment in many different ways, right? In the kind of size of the industry or how the industry was operating, and also in its complicity with the very perpetrators of extractive capitalism. We know that museums and art institutions have been founded not only as complicit to colonialism, but also as complicit to many types of extractive industries and practice that we know are harmful for the environment. So, and of course, this has been a question for us insofar as MAT, the institution where this conversation takes place, is also sponsored by an oil a corporation, a fossil fuel corporation, and so I wonder, what beyond sort of incorporating an ecological or a green or whatever you want to call agenda in its program and its discourse, what kinds, that's maybe my question to you, what kinds of structural change one would need in the very spaces that we inhabit as artists, as cultural practitioners, as intellectuals, activists, and things like that, so that the space of art can be really for a meaningful space to change the types of relationalities between among our communities.
I think there are roadmaps out there, right? There's like the Green New Deal, there's the Pacto Ecosocial in Latin America, there's the Green New Industrial Revolution in the British context, a global Green New Deal. I think it's clear, like we have to engage in degrowth across all sectors of the economy, as well as smart growth in certain areas that are underdeveloped or are suffering from impoverishment. And there needs to be a massive shift technologically toward decarbonization. Where the arts fit into all that is a big ongoing question. But I agree with you, Paulo, there's, this is what was once a very small area of specialized research among people concerned with ecology and the arts has now become, it's very widespread, international. So I think our work will definitely continue.
Maybe just if you both mentioned David Graeber's book, so in just bringing another reference in, I really appreciated, and I don't know whether you've know the work of Idris Robinson from the States, but he wrote this piece called How It Might Should Be Done, and it was about like, how does one formulate a revolutionary kind of project in the present? And it's so like taking that very kind of like well-known phrase, like what is to be done, right? That I think comes out of a kind of, originally, I think, was it under some sort of like, I think the context was actually under like, was Russian originally, and then
Chernyshenko and then Lenin.
yeah, exactly. And so, anyway, to really think about what is a revolutionary project in the present, that, and the, how does that, and the necessity for an obligation towards the dead and the exploited, as he says in that really kind of polemical piece. But I really like the way that he reformulated that kind of question, like, how might it should be done? Yeah. And we, once again, it's not something we have to include in the video, but it's, if you're interested, I really strongly suggest what, I mean, I really appreciate him as a kind of contemporary kind of radical intellectual. Yeah.
You can put that in our apocalypse reading room.
Sure.
Malema, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is the vital question, no? And I think partly what Paulo's question was also looking at the infrastructures of the kind of industry of art as well, and the kind of financial models that keep us going. Maybe less as a structural answer, but more as a kind of personal answer. I'm increasingly interested in artistic practices that are seeking ways of crossing these boundaries and trying to relate much more to their immediate communities and kind of work, I suppose, to some degree in more indigenous imaginations of a kind of cosmological connection to everything. And I think that shifting out of these kinds of ideas of art as separate from everything else is really where a lot of possibility lies, and a lot of imaginary lies. But perhaps that also, like everything else, would be kind of consumed by the financial structures of the art system. But I like the idea of being able to opt out, and I think a number of the artists we've spoken to over the year have been trying to kind of find new strategies for that sort of thing.
Yeah, I also like the term that you put forward earlier, Mo, in terms of the need for solidarity. Solidarity in terms of like suggesting to me a kind of relationality of political collaboration beyond those institutions of capture and capitalist enclosure. Even if many of us work within those systems, we don't have to think of ourselves as being completely dominated or consumed by them either. And how can we build and amplify and grow those systems of solidarity where we develop practices that express a fidelity to other ways of living, that are not extractive, that are not part of racialized and colonial capitalism. I think these are the crucial questions for how to live and how it should be done otherwise. So maybe that's a good place to stop. Thanks, everyone.